Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Missing Frames. This is the podcast where we watch all the movies we should have seen by this point in our lives. I'm your host, Shawn Eastridge. We are hanging out over here on the Nerd Party Network at thenerdparty.com. You can check us out on Twitter at Join Nerd Party, on Facebook, just The Nerd Party, and also on Instagram at The Nerd Party. There are tons of great podcasts there, so be sure to give them all a listen. And we are bringing back for the first time in 3+ years, one of the OG Missing Frames co-hosts. It's Lindsey Kendrick. Lindsey, welcome back to the show.
Oh my gosh, it is fantastic to be here. I am so pumped.
I am so pumped. You realize the last movie we watched together was The Notebook.
Yes, and I forgot that we did that, and I'm shocked that I did, because it's maybe the most memorable viewing, because we couldn't shut up while we were watching. Like, we couldn't just sit there.
That was the movie itself was not a particularly enjoyable experience, but watching it with you made it all the suffering worthwhile. I think we're going to improve this time around, though. I think we've got a better movie for you.
Oh, absolutely. I'm excited.
So we're going to be watching, it's funny because the episode before this is Once Upon a Time in the West, which I watched with my good friend John Mills. And I guess I'm now on a Leone kick. You sent me a list of movies you hadn't seen, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was on there. And I was like, you know what? I haven't seen that in so long. I just watched Once Upon a Time in the West. Let's do that. And The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a movie you haven't seen, one of the greatest films ever made, not just Westerns, but ever. Where are you as far as the Western genre? Do you enjoy it, or is this like going to be a completely diving into the deep end?
So, my first thought when we chose this movie is, oh, great, I don't really know a lot about Westerns. And then I thought again, and I realized that there are a lot of movies that I've seen, from the time I was a child to recently that count as Westerns, technically, or that use elements of the Western genre. That
Fievel Goes West?
You know what? That wasn't on my list. I actually have a list in front of me, and it's called Things That Count as Westerns, because I wanted to show that I actually do have a little bit of background knowledge.
Look at you bringing the research. See, it's been way too long. See, this is why I need you back on the show. I need some well-researched opinions, some thoughts. Let's go. Let's do this.
So I was thinking about how, from, Fievel, let's include that, to Back to the Future Part 3.
I was about to say.
The Quick and the Dead. I used to love that. Leonardo DiCaprio was like the guy when I was young.
Is The Quick and the Dead, is that Sam Raimi?
You know what? I think so. I don't want to say that it is for sure, but
it is.
It is Sam Raimi? Okay. So I remember loving it. When I was a kid, I used to watch that. I mean, and then even, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Why didn't I count that? I don't know. The 3:10 to Yuma. Yes, I haven't seen the original, but the remake of True Grit, Appaloosa, The Assassination of Jesse James, The Hateful Eight.
3:10 to Yuma. I haven't seen the original either, but I feel like on the short list of remakes that are just as good, if not better, that tends to be pretty high on those lists. And I think 3:10 to Yuma, the remake with Russell Crowe and Christian Bale, is amazing. Was that James Mangold? I think he did Logan, and he did
which is, I was just about to say, Logan is one of my favorite. Exactly. And I was thinking, and isn't it inspired by, was it Shane that they pulled from?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds
which
right.
Also I haven't seen, but I know a lot of the elements that comprise a Western, even though I didn't originally think I did. And it isn't a genre that I think that I'm gravitated towards, but I really am. Like, growing up, going to see my grandparents, my grandfather, he would always have some Western on the TV, and it was just always on in the background. And it's a very
granddad genre. It's dads and granddads.
Yes. And I feel like I never would choose one, but over the years, as I've accumulated Westerns, I feel like part of it is me caring too much about genre. It's just, I want to see a good movie. Maybe don't worry about what genres you love or what genres you don't love as much. After my husband Brandon showed me Deadwood, that's like one of my favorite shows of all time, and in the movie as well. I realize that if I think too much about, where I'm categorizing it, I might, miss out on some good ones.
Right. Well, Westerns were always a struggle for me. And I mentioned this on another episode I did with John Mills, which was when we watched The Wild Bunch, another classic Western that's directed by Sam Peckinpah. And it's absolutely incredible. If you haven't seen it, go see it. But my introduction to Westerns, I was never into them really growing up. And I don't know why that was. Maybe because it was like, I saw it as like, oh, it's like a dad thing. I'm
They
just not
feel
into it.
slow when you're a
They're
kid.
slow, like kind of old fashioned. Maybe I kind of
Mhm.
wasn't into that. And I think when I was younger, especially like older movies, I was just like, I don't care. So when I was in college and the video game Red Dead Redemption came out,
Oh
and
yeah.
I got that, and I was like, it just opened the floodgates of like, well, now I just want to find out what inspired this game and just dive into this genre. And you listed a few of the ones that I watched, but I think The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was the first movie, the first Western I watched in my my experience, my education of learning what this genre was all about. And I watched a bunch of like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was another, The Searchers, all these other ones. But I remember The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly just being like the perfect one to start with, because it's not even, it's a spaghetti Western, which, the term is basically kind of, I know Leone kind of hated that term, but basically he was Italian and he was making Westerns. So it was almost a little it was a bit of a jab in some way. Like,
Right.
it's like, oh, spaghetti Westerns, he made them. But because of the fact that you had an Italian making this very American genre of film, it has a completely different style. It's almost like maybe the Beatles of Westerns, where it's like they took everything that came before and kind of made it this very rock and roll new concoction with fresh energy. And it feels, his films felt like they were taking the Western to a whole other place that they hadn't explored. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is technically a third film of a trilogy. And it started with A Fistful of Dollars, which is essentially a remake of Yojimbo, Akira Kurosawa, one of his great movies. And then there was A Few Dollars More, and then The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And the only connection they have really is that they're Westerns and that they star Clint Eastwood playing the character who's the man with no name. So they call it the Man with No Name trilogy, or they call it the Dollars trilogy, since it's Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. That's the connecting theme between the three. And that's to say, you don't really have to have seen the other two, but you can go back and watch them because they are really good. But if you were to pick one, this is the one to watch. It's the one I really love it. It's been a long time since I've seen it.
I'm super excited, and that extra information I didn't know. The only thing I did know was the whole spaghetti Western thing, because my dad loved to tell me repeatedly why they were called spaghetti Westerns, and I was like, I get it, Dad, one movie fact.
Thanks, Dad. We can relate to each other.
No, and you know what? He does. He knows quite a bit about the older movies, and I think I just brushed it off as a kid as like, all right, Dad. But I would love to, too bad we're in quarantine, but I'd love to watch a movie like this with him.
And this is, again, it's going to be interesting watching this after watching Once Upon a Time in the West, because Once Upon a Time in the West was the film that followed The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And Leone, with that film, he was forced into making another Western because all the studios were like, no, that's all you can make. You have to make Westerns. You can't make anything else. And so he kind of made not an anti-Western, but something that was definitely not even in line with what he'd done before. And The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is much more energetic. It's much more, I don't want to say fast-paced, but it's a little bit more exciting. It's a little more action-driven, whereas Once Upon a Time in the West is a little bit more ponderous. So it'll be interesting going back and watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly again after getting used to kind of that slow,
right.
Tedious is not the right word, but it's definitely, if someone were to call it boring, I would understand it. I would also be like, you're an idiot, but also, yes, I get it. It's slow. So I'm excited to watch it in that regard too. And really just excited because it's Ennio Morricone did the score. He just passed away. And it's a legendary score. You might not even realize you know what it is until you hear it. And then you're like, that's this movie? Oh my God, I didn't even know. But it's really cool just to go back and watch these, and they're stunning and they're so well made. And yeah, I'm excited. And you can see, Tarantino especially, there's so much Leone had such huge influence on Tarantino, and you get that sense from this film. You get the sense of like, it's very violent. It's very like, the dialogue is very smart. It's got very colorful characters. At the time it was released, it was so criticized because everyone was like, it's so violent and icky. But now it's like, it's almost quaint, but
Wow, that's exciting to hear, because I always associated Westerns as having, violence, but like really mild violence. Like someone gets shot, but you don't see any blood and they just like fall over. So
this is definitely, these were a little more, they were kind of pushing the boundaries for sure. And that was, again, the spaghetti Western thing was kind of like, oh, you always knew they were going to be a little bit more edgy and a little more violent and a little grittier. But there's a sense of fun to it, similar to Tarantino, where like the violence isn't like the Wild Bunch. The film is very much a commentary on violence, and it's like the violence is bad and it's brutal and it's ugly. Whereas The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is kind of sort of relishing in it a bit in the same way like Tarantino movies do. So I think you'll see a little bit of that spark in terms of where Tarantino got those that inspiration and those influences from, for sure.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. I'm looking forward to it. And this one's long too, isn't it? Like
it's long. It's
almost
long.
3 hours.
Brace yourself. It's
I'm
almost
right.
3 hours.
I'm all right. I've been watching movies like constantly since we've been at home. This is what you need.
It'll help you pass the time. It'll be perfect. But what do you want to try to take a guess as to what you think the plot is of the movie?
Okay. So I didn't do a lot of research because I wanted to not know too much, but I feel like I remember there's like two guys going after another guy. Like, I mean, just like the most basic outline. And Clint Eastwood is like the good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, and there's, he's working with a hitman or something like that. And then the the guy that they're after is the bad guy, or he's actually the quote unquote ugly, right? I don't know if we're actually supposed to associate one with the word, but according to IMDb, they told me that.
This is a good guess. IMDb, they know what's up. So far, so good.
Yeah,
that's what the movie's about.
I really, and I know it's pretty long, so I know there has to be a lot more nuance to that, but I read like a 1-sentence summary of like what the whole like general idea of the plot is. So,
and it basically said there's a good guy, there's a bad guy, and there's an ugly guy, and they're in a Western, and that's the description.
Yes.
Perfect. We're good. I think that's it. I think we've done our part. All we can do now is watch it. So we will watch it, and we will come back to discuss it.
Oh my gosh, I'm ready.
Now available to own on video cassette.
And we're back. Lindsay, how do you feel about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? Which one of those words best describes your experience watching this film?
I feel very good about it. It was a whole lot of fun. Like, it was more fun than I was expecting. Like, I expected it to be more somber or more serious. But it was so funny, actually.
Yes. It's very, very, very energetic. And especially it's going to be interesting because, like I said, the last episode that was released is Once Upon a Time in the West. And that is the film that Leone followed this one with. And it's much slower. It's much more somber. It's a bit more thoughtful. It's still fun, but definitely much slower paced. So going back to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly after watching that is kind of like, I want to say a breath of fresh air, but that implies that Once Upon a Time in the West wasn't great, which it is. It was a lot of fun, and it was like the perfect antidote to the more methodical pacing of Once Upon a Time in the West.
Right. It was doing something different. I mean, I haven't seen it, but now I kind of want to follow it with that.
It should. I was going to ask you if it's unlocked a whole new world. Now you're like, I need to watch. I'm a Western girl, and I need to watch all of them.
Yeah, I guess, I thought the more conventional Westerns, like I've always labeled this as a conventional Western, like in my mind, but I always had sort of a stereotyped view of them. Like I'd seen a lot of the more recent Westerns, I'd seen a lot of the unconventional Westerns, and I had, stereotyped them, but this was just, it was so, and right from the beginning, like I was going and looking for what Tarantino might have borrowed for his movies, and it's just like immediately, like
Yes.
the opening credits, I'm like, oh, okay.
Pretty much,
I can see this. It was really brutal, like you were saying. It was crude, not gory, but just like, they didn't seem to sweat all of the bodies that were dropping.
No, not at all.
And some of them were actually pretty funny. I did notice, though, that there was a good contrast with the Civil War backdrop going on, and how every time they kind of cross paths with that, it did get a little bit more somber, and it highlighted kind of how ridiculous and goofy sort of like what they were doing was, in contrast to like this horrible time in American history.
Yeah, I
awful.
totally I knew the Civil War was involved, but it's been a long time since I've seen the movie, so I'd forgotten that it's a backdrop for the film. So it kind of puts the film in a specific time and place. That A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, the two films that precede this, which I also haven't seen in a long time, I don't think they are as specifically like referencing a particular time and place. So this one is very much like you said, it provides a really, really interesting context for what's going on, but it also, there's a very interesting commentary. And I think Leone was essentially saying like, hey, nobody's a good guy in this scenario. You start to feel like these three characters, Blondie, Angel Eyes, and Tuco, are the only ones who are operating of their own agency and the only ones who have figured out how to conquer the system. And really the only time, and they kind of go in and out of these sort of Civil War scenes, sort of looking at what's going on, and they go into all these different like medic facilities and clinics, and they see all the aftermath and the injuries, and we see a lot of soldiers who have lost limbs and things like that. But they're kind of just like passive observers until the end when they blow up the bridge. But really the only thing anyone says about it is when Blondie's kind of like, I've never seen such a terrible waste of men in all my life, or something along those lines. And it's interesting how there doesn't seem to be judgment to any side of it. It's almost like Leone is them sort of just kind of passing through and observing and being like, this is pretty terrible.
Right. I really appreciated how they were kind of removed from what was happening. So it kind of gave you not really an objective, but sort of an objective look at what was happening. Just like, this is a disaster, like it's such a low point in our history. I also appreciated like what you were saying about how, nobody is this like perfectly noble, good, straight edge character. Cause that's another stereotype I had for Westerns in my mind, like the classic old fashioned Western, from, maybe the 60s, where you've got at least one character that's like lawful good. And he always does the right thing. And he always stands up for, the little guy. But really, it's like these three characters are all acting out of their own self-interest.
Yes, every one of them. I was thinking about that. It's funny how, Clint Eastwood's character, this is the first time they've named him, quote unquote. And it's not really a name, it's a nickname. They call him Blondie in this one, which he didn't even have a name, I think, in the other two. But his character is the only one that kind of is, the good. All right, he's kind of the good guy here. But all three of them, you could really interchange them in terms of which adjective best describes them. Like Angel Eyes is pretty awful. He's the one who's like the cold, calculating assassin. Yes. And he shows no remorse. I mean, we see him right from the beginning murdering a family, just like cold-blooded murder in the beginning. Very brutal, very like, it just doesn't care. And the irony is Tuco, who is, I guess, the stereotypical ugly, is almost the character we sympathize with the most.
Which shocked me, because at the very beginning, and of course some of these charges might not have been accurate, but when they were listing off his charges of what he was accused of when he was going into his first hanging that he was planning on escaping from, Leone does this thing that, Tarantino does many years later, where I find myself drawn to these characters that are either morally ambiguous or just straight out kind of awful in some ways, but in other ways they have something to say, or they serve a purpose. Their character serves a purpose to like teach me something, or teach me something about myself. Because even with Angel Eyes, I was like, he murders a family, and I'm like, why am I drawn to him? Maybe it's his eyes, but like he's so appealing.
It's his angel eyes.
yeah, and then with The Ugly with Tuco, he was so like revolting to me, but he was like sort of the comic relief in a way, but
Yeah.
also like the regular guy, like the guy that you can almost relate to more.
Yeah, he's the everyman's, and because he's comic relief, you naturally are like, oh, I like him. Like you said, every character in this, you're drawn to them in a way. This is something that Leone does really well in all his movies. He casts these actors that you're just like hypnotized by them. You just want to stare at them all day. And this movie, this was the first time he worked with cinematographer Tonino Deli Colli, who would work with him again on Once Upon a Time in the West and Once Upon a Time in America, Leone's last film. And I honestly don't remember if A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More included as many dramatic close-ups, but I think that's something Deli Colli really emphasized and really brought to Leone's stylings, from what I recall. So you just have these really, really, like, you're just mesmerized by these close-ups of these really incredible faces. Like, Leone managed, even the background actors have these incredible, like, you just can't look away. And I think that's part of it. I think these actors, particularly these three, everyone's great, but these three leads are so good that you can't help but love them, even though what they're doing is terrible. And Eli Wallach's character Tuco is the best example, because like you said, if these charges that are being leveled against him are accurate, it's like, this guy's pretty despicable. But then you go through the film and you spend so much time with him, and then you have this scene where he runs into his brother at this monastery, and they have this conversation and this exchange, and you start to learn a little bit more about Tuco. And you sympathize with him more, and because he feels the most human, you have this cold-blooded assassin in Angel Eyes, and then you have this kind of detached, sort of stoic character with the Man with No Name, or Blondie. And like you said, Tuco's the most human, so you almost root for him, even though he does despicable things. He even like basically murders. He tries to murder Blondie. He like makes him walk through the desert, tortures him essentially, and then is like, all right, now I'm going to kill you. And the only thing that stops him is greed. So it's like, this guy's pretty despicable.
I was so angry with him when he was left out in the desert. I thought it was pretty fair, considering he seemed pretty awful. So I was like, good, you know what? And he gives him sort of a fair shot, where he maybe will make it out. And when he did crawl back into town and got the water, I was like, this guy doesn't die. And then it's repeated over and over. He just does not die. And I think I was underestimating his skill, or his talent in survival. But when he does the same thing to Blondie, and I was taking notes, and one of my notes, they're not super profound. One of my notes just said scabby faces with a frowny face, because that was that was kind of the most like grossest part to me, was just they're like just completely, their faces are practically like falling apart because of the sun, and the makeup is incredible.
Yes, and it's 1966. It's very brutal.
Yes, and then he has the audacity to say like, "Oh, you're gonna die," when he's like, when Blondie's getting revived, and he's like, "Well, you better tell me, where the gold is, because I'm taking care of you." It's like, you just tried to kill him. Why on earth would he reveal anything to you right now?
But there's kind of this thing where you wonder if Blondie is just making it up, if he's just being smart. He's like, oh yeah, I know the name of the grave. And then you find out later on, it's like, oh no, he actually did have the information. But Blondie's smart, and I love the way that he basically uses that situation to his advantage to be like, oh, well, I got the name, so now can't kill me. Sorry. And Blondie, he's coy. He's a clever one.
Yes, he is definitely, I would label him as the smartest of the three.
Have you seen Clint Eastwood like in his, I don't know if you'd call it his heyday, because Clint Eastwood has made great movies and delivered amazing performances in his older age. And even in Westerns, I'm thinking of Unforgiven, which he also directed, which is an incredible film. But have you haven't had a chance to really see him as like the classic, this is the character that made him. And when people think of Clint Eastwood, they're either thinking of Dirty Harry or this, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly really launched his career. Is this the first time you've gotten to kind of see him in this particular style?
You know what? I think so. I mean, I might have seen little bits and pieces, but I looked at his age when this was filmed, and I think he was like 36, and it just really tickles me to see these classic Hollywood actors when they were, you know, not very far off from my age, and he's so young
and I mean, Scott Eastwood, his son, is like this spitting image of him in this film. I don't know if you've seen Scott Eastwood. Everyone out there, just Google Scott Eastwood. But that was my first thought, is like, oh my God, his son looks just like him. I didn't know he was 36. He looks younger than 36.
He has he has such a baby face. And I think I had seen maybe a little bit of him back in the day, but I'm so used to the more recent stuff because he's still like cranking stuff out. I kind of said like, this was really nice, you know, before he was yelling at empty chairs, before there was some odd thing, you know, we have weird associations with actors. Yes. And that's one of the first things. Of course, you know, he has a lot more to his life than just that, but it's nice to see him like way back, kind of like when it all was getting going, you know,
when he's like a hungry actor and he has something to prove. And the other thing that's great about his performance too, very much in the Leone style, it's very much like a visual thing. Like I remember I was watching an interview with Eli Wallach where it's like on the day on the set, you're like, you know, I don't know, you know, Eastwood seems like he's acting, but he's not really, he's just kind of quiet and he's unassuming. And you see it on the screen and you see it in the film. Again, that magnetism and that quiet, like it became kind of a parody because, you know, Dirty Harry, he sort of does that too, that same sort of the strong silent type who with just a couple phrases can really like, you know, get his point across. But that was something that I remember the first time I watched this, it was just like, he's so powerful. The performance is so powerful without him having to really do anything. And he can make you laugh like with just a deadpan delivery, like the note that they find in the dead body where he's like, he's trying to read the word idiots and he goes, idiots, it's for you. Like things like that, where it's just like, it's so simple. And I feel like Eastwood has been parodied all of his life for this, but you forget just how effective it is and how good he is at doing that.
Yeah, but he's way like the comedy. Like I know we're saying Tuco is like the comic relief, but Clint Eastwood is hilarious, and I was expecting to be more of like the straight man, but he doesn't have to say a lot to be effective, and like you said before, those close-ups are so compelling. Like and how Leone makes use of them. Actually, I was watching with Brandon, my husband, and he was like close up, like close up. Yeah, because they really stand out. And
well, we talked about it. I talked about it with John Mills when we watched Once Upon a Time in the West, and that was a few years later. But even then, I mean, this was the '60s, so especially for a Western, I really don't think it was very, very different. I mean, even at the time, people were. It still stands out today. That's how incredible these films are. All Leone's films feel so distinctive and have such an identity that it still stands out today and can still, sometimes with older movies, you kind of have to be like, all right, well, you sort of have to put yourself in the mindset of what it was like to film at the time. These movies feel very modern to me. Like, even though they were made they're like 50 years old now, they still feel modern. And a lot of it is those close-ups. And that was something that really, I don't think was being done a lot. And Westerns, like you said, it's not, you're not wrong when you say the Western genre, it does have a rep for being kind of dull because it tends to be, and especially in this time, it wasn't really morally ambiguous. It was very much like the good guys, the bad guys. I think The Searchers with John Wayne, directed by John Ford, kind of started to explore a little bit more, and other great Westerns were kind of doing it. But I feel like Leone's the first one to really emphasize with his style, in addition to the moral ambiguity of the characters, like his visual style feels very like bold, and it's very it's just very jarring, but not in a bad way, like in a way where it's just like Brandon said, it's like close-ups. Oh my God. I mean, the first shot is like, you just see this, it's this wide shot of the landscape, and then this face just comes up into frame, like right, and you're kind of like, you sort of lean back, you're like, oh my God, all right, well, we're right in this now. But I love that, and I think it gives this such a distinctive feel, but were there any other stylistic things you noticed that you appreciated? The title cards in the opening is another thing I think of, where they list, you see Tuco the first time jumping out the window and it freeze frames and says the ugly again, very much. And they do that with each character and
Yes.
very much, obviously inspired Tarantino, but were there any other stylistic choices that you really appreciated or didn't expect from this kind of film?
I mean, I guess I was expecting a lot from the score, like getting into the music, but I was just, I mean, even halfway through, I was like, oh my God, the score is so good. Like it hits at the right time. There are times where it's funny. There are times where it's pensive. There are times where it feels sad. Like there's such a range to it. And I just got such a kick out of how much fun it was. And I was listening for it, but I still, and obviously everybody knows like that. You told me I would recognize it, and of course, I did.
Did you know that was the theme song for this movie?
I knew it was one of them, but I don't think I would have known like off the top of my head that music was from this specific movie. And then I was like, oh, okay.
I could listen to the soundtrack all day. I mean, Morricone, he was an absolute legend, and his music for these films, again, you think of the themes and you think of, I mean, it's iconic and everybody knows the theme, even if they don't know anything about the good, the bad, and the ugly. But you also forget, like you said, it's nuanced, and it's not just these really catchy themes. There's other stuff. There's emotional stuff, and the guy was a genius, and you see that even more in Once Upon a Time in the West with his score in that. But I love one of my favorite musical moments. Again, this is something Leone loves to do. The contrast between like the beauty of the music or the beauty of the sound, and you juxtapose that with just really horrific things happening on screen. And I think the most violent portion of the movie is when Tuco is getting tortured by Angel Eyes and his crony, that general or the captain, whoever it is. But like you have the Confederate soldiers singing outside because they orchestrate them, they get them to sing so people can't hear the torture going on inside. But you have this really kind of mournful, like beautiful song being sung, undercutting these really, really awful moments, like very brutal moments. I mean, when he like gets his thumbs in his eyes and starts squeezing, it's like, oh my God, this is really incredible. And it doesn't surprise you. Like, you're like, well, it's no wonder people were so upset by this film when it came out. It's so violent, and it is like, by today's standards, I mean, we've seen so much worse, but like you do kind of feel that. You do kind of feel the sense of like, oh yeah, I could see why audiences were maybe a little turned off by this at the time.
Oh yeah, I was yelling at that moment where the eyes part. I was like, like, I started like out audibly, and I see like I nothing really phases me, but again, I just wasn't expecting all of that violent flavor, which was great.
Yeah, the same. I love this. The New York Times, it was Renata Adler, said that the film must be the most expensive, pious, and repellent movie in the history of its peculiar genre. Wow. I mean, Westerns weren't really that respected, and especially like spaghetti Westerns were kind of seen, I guess, as exploitation films. Like they were people were very condescending about them, and Leone was very determined to kind of legitimize the Western. And I'm pretty sure The Searchers was out before this, and I don't know exactly the history of that film and whether or not it was well received at the time. I know now people are like, oh, it's a masterpiece. But it feels like, in general, the Western genre was pretty looked down upon, and Leone really loved the genre and took it upon himself with a limited budget. And The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly had a bigger budget than his other two films before this. But even with limited means, the scope of it feels so epic and so like big, and he was very determined to make, like, that was so intentional, and it was his purpose was to make the Western feel like just as cinematic and epic as any well-respected genre at the time.
Right. I wonder, and I don't know if you know, I was thinking, and something that I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't realize with the whole spaghetti Western is that like the movie was filmed silently, like completely silently, and they dubbed it later. Yes. And because I was looking, and Brandon and I were like, oh, there's a lot of dubbing, and duh, like people are speaking other languages, and that's exactly over.
It. So Leone,
people stereotype that, do you think?
So, well, here's the thing. So Leone didn't speak English,
Right.
And he didn't care about capturing sound on the day. He obviously cares so much about what the final product sounds like, and sound plays such an important role in all his films, and especially this and Once Upon a Time in the West. It's incredible what he's able to pull off. But his whole thing was, I don't care what we capture on the day as far as sound. So you had actors, one actor would be speaking English. What's funny is Tuco, the actor who played Tuco's brother, I think spoke I think he spoke Spanish, and Eli Wallach, who plays Tuco, couldn't understand him on the day, or whatever language he was speaking. They did not speak the same languages. So that actor was speaking in his native language. Eli Wallach was speaking in English, and then later on what they would do is Leone would just dub it. And there were a lot of different markets for his film, so he could show it in Spain, he could show it in Italy, he could show it in America, and he would just dub it for every particular country. But another reason he would do that is because he wanted to sometimes he had early versions of Morricone's score, and he would sometimes just play them on the day during the scenes to set the mood, to be like, all right, this is the mood we're going for. And he would just play it like while they were acting and while they were playing out certain scenes. And Clint Eastwood would talk about how nobody respected, when the cameras were rolling, nobody cared. Like offset, they knew that the sound they captured was eventually going to be dubbed over. So he said you could hear people talking, people were just being really loud, construction workers. And he was like, it was really hard as an actor to get into character. But that's something in all of Leone's movies. I talked about this in the Once Upon a Time in the West episode, but the first time I saw this, I was like, am I watching the wrong version? Should I be watching an Italian language version with subtitles? And it took me a little bit to realize, like, oh no, the English dubbed version is like, that was the original version that was released in America. And the dubbing, surprisingly, in some scenes it's much more obvious, but the dubbing is actually not bad. Like, it's not like a Godzilla movie where it's so clearly dubbed to the point where it's comical. You can kind of go with it, and a lot of it has to do with, I think, the actors playing their roles and dubbing themselves. But how did that feel to you? Did it bother you at all?
No, I adjusted pretty quickly. We immediately had to like stop for a second and look it up just to make sure we like understood how this movie was made. In terms of sound, and just like the fact that there's probably a bunch of different languages going on. And my first thought was kind of what you said about I would, as an actor, I would feel like it would be so hard to get into character and to go through the scenes in that way. Like, I feel like that's a challenge, but they did so well with that.
They do. And I don't know what it is. I mean, I know, I think it was Henry Fonda, who was in Once Upon a Time in the West. He was friends with Eli Wallach, who plays Tuco. And he asked him when Leone came around to cast Henry Fonda in that movie. He asked Eli, he was basically like, what should I do? And basically he said, oh, it's the most fun you'll ever have. You have to do it. It's interesting considering some of the challenges and some of the like legitimate dangers on set. Because in Italy, you can get away with a lot more, or you could get away with a lot more than in America. There weren't as many restrictions as far as protections for actors and legal things. So like certain scenes, like one of the most amazing shots, I think, in the film is when Tuco is trying to get the handcuffs off, and he brings the dead body over to the train track. And I'm like, that's very clearly him. They shot it in a way where you can tell it's him. There's very clearly a train, like there's no trickery here. This is obviously, they caught it all in camera. But Eli Wallach talked about how, he kept his head down and the train comes over. Apparently there was a metal staircase on the train, like a step up, so you could step up and get into the train. And he realized as the train passed, like when he got up finally, he was like, oh my God, if I had happened to lift my head, that would have killed me. And there were and you see that all the time with explosions and like the bridge exploding. Again, an incredible shot. And originally Leone wanted them to be closer. And Clint Eastwood, who had already been through a couple of these productions and knew how kind of lax they were with safety precautions and regulations, basically took Wallach under his wing and was like, don't worry. He's like, you stick with me. I'll make sure you don't get hurt. And he said, like, when Leone was like, all right, I want you guys down here, Eastwood was like, Sergio, where are you going to be? And he's like, oh, we're way up here with the camera. We're up on that hill. And Eastwood goes, well, I think that's where we should be too, don't you? And he was like, oh yeah, sure. But you look at the scene with the explosion and it's like, okay, from a safe distance, they still get hit by the shockwave, and then debris is falling all around them. And it's just like you say, the challenges I imagine were crazy, but it seems like people really enjoyed doing the films, at least.
That's incredible. I had no idea that they were that close to that explosion. And the train scene definitely stuck out to me too, because I did also notice, like, I thought, okay, maybe when he jumps on it, like, the train's probably moving slower than it looks like. But like, I didn't realize that he was literally, right by the train when he puts the handcuff over it. Man. Yeah. That's a great scene though. Another thing that, makes me think of Tarantino a little bit with, not saying that Tarantino's known for always being unsafe, but just,
sometimes
a little bit, maybe.
There's a lot of stuff. I think it really it's the music, it's the violence, it's the style, and that sense of like anything can happen, like that dangerous sense of like unpredictability that you expect from a Tarantino movie, and you go back and watch this and you start to think like, oh yeah, this is something very clearly he got from that. Tarantino's violence is very similar, where a lot of times Tarantino plays it for not laughs, but it's so exaggerated that you're not like, I'm thinking of Kill Bill when in particular in Volume 1, where the bride takes out all these guys and she's chopping off limbs and blood is spraying everywhere, but it's not like horrific. It's kind of like tongue-in-cheek and so exaggerated that you can't help but kind of find it hilarious.
It's so
but
over
there's
the top.
Also, yes, and Django Unchained is another good example. When you get to the end and the climax and he's having all these ridiculous shootouts and it's so absurd, but then Tarantino, like Leone, with the scene where Tuco is getting tortured, and it's all of a sudden like, oh no, this is bad, and the violence is very brutal and you feel it. It's the same thing with Tarantino, where you have scenes like DiCaprio's character is like making his slaves fight each other, and like the dogs, like you have these moments where like the dogs are coming in and they show flashbacks of them tearing people apart. It provides the stakes without ruining the fun of the movie or the fun of the violence. But it is something interesting. It's something that Tarantino gets taken to task for a lot. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of like, do you get that sense of like, does the violence feel reprehensible, or does it feel kind of like in the spirit of fun or that kind of style? Like, do you think Leone does a good job balancing that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it works for me. I mean, there's so many movies I love that are violent. I mean, I've not explored the Western genre as much as I should have, but I've seen every single, Tarantino movie, most of them multiple times. And it's not just that I have a stomach for violence, which yes, I do. I guess I'm used to it. I don't get fazed that much anymore, but it's not just there just for the sake of it. Like, I feel like sometimes it's saying something, and even when it's not saying something, it gives like, I don't know, the vibe of the movie. Like, it fits the characters too. Like the fact that the characters are so morally ambiguous, I feel like something wouldn't feel authentic if it wasn't that violent. I mean, especially that time period. I mean, I can't believe that it wasn't, awful what we know.
And you also have the Civil War. That's a huge part of it. And the Civil War is treated very much as like these, like you said, these guys are like, they don't care who they kill, but even they are able to look at this terrible event and kind of the seriousness of it and see how barbaric and awful it is. Like, they're just kind of like, why are these guys fighting? Like, it's like, they know what they're fighting for. They want gold. They're killing for gold and money and greed and all that stuff. But they look at what's happening here on a larger scale. And even they are kind of, in a way, I almost wonder if Leone was sort of making his own opinion clear in terms of like, what these guys are doing is very different from what this is and what's happening here.
Yeah, they're not killing for a flag. They're not killing for, some of the soldiers that they showed were remarkably young. They look like little boys, and which was, also realistic, but just like these people were just sent out to fight, and, many of them obviously didn't even like what they were, doing, and didn't like what they were in the middle of. You had to be drunk to be able to participate for some of them. So there's no end goal that seems satisfying for any
and
of them.
Also the sense of like, yeah, nobody is really achieving anything. It's almost like the sense of like, what are you fighting for? And they don't even really know. They're just kind of pawns in this giant game. And then the fact that Leone almost wisely depicts both sides as being equally reprehensible and equally sympathetic. It's like you forget like the cause of the war, and at the core of it, it's like, okay, obviously like this, what the Union is fighting for and what the Confederacy is fighting for, there's no question as to who was right and who was wrong, or who was morally right and who was morally wrong in there. But you forget about the human cost of it, that I think Leone is very interested in. And I love that he has these very quiet moments where on the one end, Blondie gives a drink to the dying captain as he, like his last, he gets that drink of wine. And then later on, there's a Confederate soldier who's dying, and he gives him a final smoke. And it's just this moment of like stripping away sort of the label and the layer of artifice that the war brings, and just breaking it down on a human level and saying these are two. They may be fighting for different sides, but they're both human, and they both deserve that comfort before they go. Almost, I thought that was very powerful. It's why I think. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, even though it is fun and it is exciting, and it's not as intense in terms of what it's trying to say as a commentary as later Leone films, it still feels like he's starting to evolve and mature as a filmmaker, because he has something more to say about things like that.
Yes.
I love Roger Ebert's review, where he said in his original review, he described The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly as a 4-star movie, but only gave it 3 stars, perhaps because it was a spaghetti Western and so could not be art.
Oh my goodness. I wonder if he changed his opinion on that, because Ebert definitely changes quite a bit over time.
He definitely did.
He reflects back. Good.
Yeah, but I think, at the time, the genre was so overlooked and so underappreciated that even the beauty of that subtext in this film and that commentary on the war, basically it's a very like, war, what is it good for mindset, but it is kind of amazing that in this fun, really exciting, it's a fast-paced film. It feels, every time I sit down to watch it, I'm like, oh my god, 3 hours, and then by the end of it I'm like, that really flew by in a way that not many 3-hour movies do.
It didn't feel long at all.
No, and that's what I was going to ask you in terms of pacing too. Like, again, the movie strikes the balance between the serious subtext, but also it's very focused on the energy and the fun of it. So at 3 hours, did you ever feel the length? How did you feel about the pacing? Were you ever bored, or did it really keep your attention throughout?
It kept my attention. I made a point to kind of try to eliminate distractions as best I could. But I think it kind of goes back and forth between, slowing down at the appropriate times and then speeding up before it gets to be too much. And then, slowing down. So it's not like a breakneck speed where you don't even get a chance to like breathe. It knows when it needs to breathe. It knows it needs to stop and like take a breath for a moment. And then it's like, all right, let's go. And it moves on to the next event.
I also love the way he paces his action in this. And he takes it to another extreme in Once Upon a Time in the West, where that movie is almost so slow. But in this, the way he builds tension and the way, like, the editing, like, for instance, the final showdown in the graveyard, which, first of all, the graveyard itself, which was like, did they build all of this? Was this there? This is insane.
Yes,
first of all,
it's incredible.
Yeah, but like, they're in this stone circle. I don't know how long it takes for this entire shootout to play out, but it feels like it takes forever. And they're kind of slowly taking their spots. So they're all kind of preparing to show down. And the way it's cut and the way it's edited, and of course Morricone's music contributes so much to it, but I love the way he's able to build suspense and literally nothing's happening.
Yes.
It's just these three guys looking at each other, like a cut, like just showing a quick shot of one of their hands at the gun, their eyes kind of darting back and forth. And he does that and he holds it to the point where it's almost unbearable, but it's so captivating. There's so much in this movie that I think when you describe it, it could sound really, really boring. But I love the way he stages those big moments, those big bursts of violence where it's almost like the lead up is more important than the actual shooting, like the actual moment of supposed excitement. Like, to me, the excitement doesn't come with the shooting. It's that build up to that moment. But how did you feel about that kind of stuff?
I agree, absolutely. The ending was my favorite part. I had no idea, even, up until the very last second, I had no idea how it was going to turn out. I couldn't predict what would happen because there had been so many things leading up into that part that I could never have predicted. Like, I thought it was going to go one way and then it went a completely different way. I had no idea anyone would be teaming up with Tuco. Like, I thought nobody would ever work with him. So the fact that, and it ends up making sense because I feel like, Angel Eyes and Blondie, neither one of them could exert power over the other. So it kind of made sense. But again, I just wasn't predicting that. And then by the time it got to the very end, when they have the three standing there, I didn't want it to speed up, but I was so anxious. And it's just like you like want to relish it and savor it because it's just so great. It's just like this delicious moment. It's like my favorite scene is that ending. And I think he did it perfectly. I'm like captivated. Nobody's saying anything. I'm like, what's gonna happen? Like, is there gonna be a twist? Who's gonna shoot who? Did anybody plan anything out? Are they all like every man for himself, like it seems like? And I did not predict the ending. That's for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's one of my favorite endings ever. Were there any other scenes in the movie that stood out to you as like really like, oh my God, I love this so much?
Oh, that's a good question because there's quite a few. Definitely, I mean the scene with the train that we went over, the bridge scene, the banter back and forth, like after Blondie came out of the desert and he was all crusty, just like them, recovering for a while. I loved the scene with Tuco and his brother because I think it shed a whole lot of light on who he was as a person. Like, it actually got to the real heart of who he was and his family dynamic. But I love all those scenes for like different reasons too. They all give me something different.
I agree. I mean, in a 3-hour movie, you have to have something to hold your attention. And that was what amazed me watching it, is just like, I was like, every scene in this movie is amazing. Like, I don't know if you knew this, but for the original theatrical, like the version you watched, the 3-hour version, is a version that was recently put together, or well, not recently, but early 2000s.
I
was
thought
put
so.
Together.
I thought that's what I looked up. So they added in scenes, right?
That's exactly right. They actually got Eli Wallach and Lee Van Cleef and Clint Eastwood to do new dubbing for these scenes that they discovered. So what happened was the Italian version, I think, was 2 hours and 46 minutes. So even that was cut down from this final version that we currently have access to, that I think is the only version you can buy on Blu-ray, or the only version you can rent. So the Italian version was 2 hours, 46 minutes. For the American market, those distributors convinced Leone. They were like, oh, no one's going to see a 3-hour movie. You have to cut it down even more. And Leone was furious, but he was like, well, I get if you say so, but I'm not happy about it. But it was a 2-hour, 20-minute movie. And I don't know what was cut out of it. But to me, I watched this and it's so, every scene and every moment is so, each little sequence has such a great punctuation mark and has such a, like you said, there's the scene between him and his brother, or there's a little laugh line or an exchange or something that comes out and really makes that scene feel so important and necessary. I don't know what you would cut out. But again, the really cool thing is when they were bringing it to DVD and remastering it and getting all the footage together, they managed to get those scenes from the Italian version and put them back in to the English dub version, and then bring the original actors back to do their parts. And I don't know which scenes it is. Like, apparently you can tell that like Clint Eastwood sounds older or Eli Wallach sounds older, but I honestly couldn't tell you.
I think that there was one or two scenes where I don't think I pinpointed at first, but because we had looked that up Brandon said, he sounds a little bit older. Not Clint Eastwood as much. I think it was Eli Wallach who was like, there's a little edge to his voice. It's not something that jumps out where you're like, oh my gosh, what is this, weirdness? But it's, if you're really, really listening for it, you can say, this sounds a little bit different. But
that's true. Yeah. If someone pointed it out to me, I'm sure I would be like, oh my God, yeah, of course. But I never notice it when watching.
I mean, because you're kind of caught up in what's happening and everything seems like, it could be very important and you wouldn't know what would be extraneous,
Right. Other things I love Tuco talking to a dead chicken. As much as it hurts me to see a dead chicken that looks like it was a real chicken. I love that. I love Tuco talking to the sneaking into the shop with the guns to get some guns.
Gosh, yes.
That whole scene. First of all, I love that the shopkeeper pretty much knows he's going to get robbed, but is like, okay, all right, just come in and let's get this over with. So apparently Eli Wallach had never really held a gun before, didn't know anything about guns, and Leone was like, it's fine, I'm gonna put all this stuff out on the table, you just mess with it. And so that entire scene is improvised, him picking things up and looking through the barrels and listening to the click of it as he holds it up to his ear. All of that was improvised, and was improvised from Wallach's complete lack of knowledge on how you're supposed to check a gun, what a person who loves guns would do to check and make sure that the gun is up to snuff with what he wants. I love that so much. And I love that it ends with him putting the closed sign again. Mouth. Another improvised moment apparently that they came up with on the day, where he just puts that in his mouth.
It was so goofy because I was actually fully expecting him to shoot the shop owner, because I'm like, why? He just seemed like he was exuding danger, when he tested out the guns, and he was so accurate, and I was like, you really can't mess with this guy. And I thought that the shopkeeper was going to bother him to the point where he just shoots him, but no, he just takes the close sign and just sticks it right into his mouth, walks away.
And again, it makes him really endearing, where you just can't hate the guy, because the shopkeeper, who, like you said, if it was Angel Eyes in there, he probably would have killed the guy. But it's Tuco, and Tuco's just having fun, and it's like, all right, I'm good. I got what I needed. You can live. Also, let me just do this too. Tuco has so many. I mean, the moment where the guy comes into which is totally ripped off in Die Hard, but the moment where the guy comes in, he's like, I'm going to shoot you. And basically he has the gun in the bathtub, and he's like, if you're going to kill somebody, kill them. Don't talk to them. In Die Hard, they have a very similar exchange where Bruce Willis is under the table and this guy's shooting at him. And he's like, oh, where are you going to go? He's like, next time you get a chance to kill somebody, don't miss the opportunity. And so he shoots him and he goes, thanks for the advice. I'm almost positive that was a direct reference to that moment in this movie. Yeah,
and come to think of it, Die Hard has kind of a very Western sort of feel,
They even call it out with the yippee-ki-yay.
Yeah, yippee-ki-yay.
Partial to Roy Rogers and things like that. But I think it's very intentional, but I love all that. I also love the visual gag of them thinking they found the Confederate. They're our fellow Confederates. We'll just pretend we're one of them, and then it's just gray dust.
I took that. I meant to say that when I was talking about my favorite scenes, because I just about fell over. First of all, I was like, why are they still wearing these Confederate outfits? They should get back into their normal clothes. But anyway, there was a point to it, because it made that scene funny when he went so over the top, like, hey, yay. He was yelling, cheers to Dixie and all of that.
Down with General Grant. Hooray for, what's his name? Lee. Yeah, General Lee. Hooray.
And then when he pats the guy approaches them, pats his arm, and just reveals the blue underneath. That was so brilliant, and that was one of the absolute funniest moments in the movie. I wrote that down. Hilarious.
The movie is very funny. I don't know, and I haven't seen Once Upon a Time in America, and I haven't seen Duck You Sucker, which is the film. So there are two trilogies that Leone did. He did one film, and then there's the Man with No Name trilogy, which is concluded with this film. Mm-hmm. And then he did the Once Upon a Time trilogy, which is Once Upon a Time in the West, A Fistful of Dynamite, or Duck You Sucker, which is the title I prefer to call it, and Once Upon a Time in America. But it feels like, just based on Once Upon a Time in the West, which does have great comic moments and comic beats and great dialogue. The good, the bad, and the ugly it feels a little bit more like the rock and roll version of Leone, where he's a little bit more zany and a little bit more willing to have fun with like visual comedy like that, whereas he gets a little bit more serious in Once Upon a Time in the West. And I don't know, with a title like Duck You Sucker, I imagine it's a return to the kind of insanity of the Man with No Name trilogy, but who knows? I could be wrong. I would love to see that. I need to see that. But
it's a bizarre title.
It's a bizarre title, and maybe the best title. But what else? Is there anything else we haven't covered that you think we should talk about?
There's nothing really that I don't think a whole topic we haven't covered. I was tweeting halfway through the movie. I just said, I'm halfway through my first time seeing this movie. And somebody gave me a little, like, I don't want to say it's a fun fact because it's kind of a sad fact. Someone with the Twitter handle Real Film Cricket. So now we're friends, but he told me
just because of the name, not because of anything else.
Well, I love making friends with movie fans online
with Real Film Crickets.
Yeah, and I love learning because I know that if I talk to people who are super into movies, I'm bound to learn something I don't know. Worst case scenario, if I already know it, then I can say I already know it. I'm not going to feel offended, but there was a Canadian actor who was like a bit part in this movie, Al Mullock. And he is also in Once Upon a Time in the West, but he died by suicide while they were filming Once Upon a Time in the West. And he's the one-armed, he's like the one-armed, the guy he's killed by Tuco like halfway through.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, his character, I think, is also killed in Once Upon a Time in the West, but he jumped out of his hotel. I mean, trigger warning, it's not super gruesome, but he actually survived the fall. But when he fell, he ended up dying on the way to the hospital. But he dropped, and the production manager and the screen manager saw his body just like fall past their windows. Yeah. And what's super sad about it is, just looking at even the Wikipedia page, there's hardly any information on this guy in terms of like why he did it. There's some speculation, but it's always, it's a little, when you look up these bit characters or just, anybody from a movie and you want to see, what happened to them, or, what did they end up doing? And you find these stories, but there's a lot of rumors surrounding them.
I remember reading that, and what's even worse, want to hear something that will make you feel
I started bringing in the sad.
Apparently Leone, I don't know if the guy was wearing his outfit when he jumped, but apparently Leone went after him and was like, make sure we get that outfit back. And after he found out the guy was dead, his first concern was like, we need the costume.
Get the costume off this guy. Awful. I hope that's not true, because that makes it even more sad.
Leone's, he was a genius, but he was very obsessive and very, he was a filmmaker. And
kind of a jerk sometimes.
Yeah. Another great story is about the movie. So the bridge that they blew up, this will be a little more, this is hopefully not as sad as this story.
We don't need to end on the sad.
We'll try to end on a slightly better story of Leone freaking out. But the bridge, so the Spanish army, I think they filmed in Spain, I want to say. I don't know where exactly, but the army, the Spanish army, helped out so much that Leone was like, well, he gave it to the general, I think. He was like, do you want the honors of blowing up the bridge? And the general was like, oh my God, boy, do I ever. So they were getting everything set up. They weren't rolling. And somehow through the walkie-talkie, they were saying, like, in Italian, they were basically saying, okay, we're all pretty much set up. We're pretty much good to go. Basically saying everything was okay. Not that they were rolling, but that it was okay and everything was prepared.
Oh no.
The general, this dude, thought that they were saying it's okay, go ahead and blow it up. So he was like, okay, great. He blows up the bridge. No cameras are rolling at all. Leone was furious. He fired the assistant who came through on the walkie-talkie and said everything's okay. He fired that assistant. The general felt he felt so bad that he said, we're gonna the entire army is gonna rebuild the bridge for you, no charge. but on one condition: you have to rehire that assistant
poor guy
who made the mistake. So Leone said, all right, I'll hire him back. But
so they rebuilt the entire bridge.
They rebuilt the entire bridge so they could blow it up again. But the army rebuilt it for them because they felt so mortified that they made the mistake in the first place. But Eastwood was basically, he said he was joking on the day, like when it happened. He was like, "Oh, I hope they were rolling cameras." And then he found out, he was like, "Oh, that they weren't rolling cameras." And he said you could just hear Leone. He's like using every possible curse word in Italian you could imagine, just like freaking out. He's red in the face. He's like, "I don't know if I've ever seen him so angry in all my life." But yeah, there you go. Another fun Leone story. But
it's great though, because now I not only do I want to watch some other Westerns, some other Leone, but I want to research more about what went into making these movies, some of the background stories, because I just think it's fascinating.
It's great. And Leone, he had to contend with a lot of, I don't know if Once Upon a Time in America was something that was well received when it first came out, but I don't think he was ever appreciated in his time. Like, it felt like every movie that came out, people were like, "Oh, this is dumb. This is a Western. That's for it's not sophisticated cinema like we love." I mean, as you can tell from Roger Ebert's review, he was very condescending, and he eventually came around. But I think I hope, I don't know, but I hope that Leone started to feel that respect before he passed away. And I know that Henry Fonda, he worked with him, and Fonda knew that Leone by that point was like, "Oh my God, it's Sergio Leone. He's a master filmmaker." But I think the critical community was a little bit slower on the uptake with that one. But now, I mean,
the criminal community was on board.
The criminal community loved it. They were like, "Yeah, these movies are violent and crazy. We love it." But the guy is a genius. I'm so glad that I got to introduce this to you and that you enjoyed it. I couldn't encourage you. I'd highly encourage you to go and watch his other stuff too.
Yeah. And I'm glad that I, went along with this movie. I mean, not that I would have said no when I wouldn't have listed it as an option when I was thinking about, some movies I hadn't seen yet that I quote unquote should have seen. I don't necessarily gravitate towards just like, oh, this is a feminine movie, this is a girly movie. I never did. Like I said, I love all kinds of movies. I just love good movies. But there's something about the Western genre that I've never felt confident enough talking about. And I think that part of it is just me being socialized as a woman and a girl. And I feel like if I start to speak on movies like Westerns, there's just going to be some guy who just pops in and says, "Well, actually,
well, what are you talking about?
What do you have to say about this?" Even with something like Tarantino, which I said I've seen everything of his multiple times. Sometimes I feel hesitant to speak about it because there's going to be some guy who just interrupts and corrects me, or makes me feel that I'm not supposed to be talking about it. I don't know. It's weird.
Well, don't feel that way, because first of all, you're awesome. And you, as far as my friends go, are in terms of your opinions on film, you're one of my favorite people to hear from. And I love reading your reviews. So don't feel that way.
Thank you. And, I feel a little bit more confident. So I think I'm going to dive in some more now.
More Westerns and tweet all about them.
Oh, I will.
So on a scale of 1 to 5, men with no names, how many would you give The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest?
Oh my gosh. This is hard. I feel like I need to rewatch it to know for sure. My first inclination is 4.5 or 5. I really loved it. It was so much fun. Yeah. And I can't point out many parts that I take issue with. I don't know. If I'm going to be really nitpicky, I don't know, 4.5 guys, or
you can say 4.5. You can rewatch it. 4.5 is still 4.5 is still good. 4.5 men with no name is still good.
I'm very enthusiastic about movies that I like, so I'm like, yes, all the stars, all the men with no names.
I will give it. I'll go ahead and give it 5. I've seen it before, but I totally get. There are films I've watched on Missing Frames where I know they're masterpieces, and I'm just like, I need to see it again, or I need to absorb it, or I need to think about it. So I totally get that, but yes. Yeah, it's great, and I'm glad you loved
fantastic. It. I would definitely rewatch. I want to watch it with my dad. I feel like That would be super fun.
I mean, I assume he's a fan.
My dad's a real sci-fi guy, actually. But movies, just in general, he's so open-minded, and like the movies that came out in the 60s and 70s, I feel like he has an extra, knowledge or perspective on, that I would.
This will be great.
So, yeah.
You can watch it again and it'll be awesome. Well, Lindsey, once you start watching more Westerns and start tweeting about them, and the internet wants to hear all your amazing opinions about them, where can they find you?
Okay, we'll do. Yeah, Twitter is I probably talk mostly about movies there. My Twitter handle is at a tiny Amazon, 3 words with underscores between, a tiny Amazon.
And I am at Yeshandorman on Twitter. And as you no doubt have guessed, I kind of went on a little Leone kick. So Lindsey, thank you again for indulging my sudden need to watch The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly again after watching Once Upon a Time in the West. But I want to hear all about the Leone fans, all the Leone opinions. Which one's his best movie? There's like this argument of, is Once Upon a Time in the West his masterpiece? Is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly his masterpiece? Are they all his masterpieces? I want to see where everyone falls on that side of the argument. And feel free to reach out to me there. I'm at Shawn Dorman on Instagram, and also Letterboxd. I'm on Letterboxd. Shawn Dorman, I think. But Lindsey, thank you again. I don't think, in this case, I think we're both the men with the loaded guns. I don't think either of us are in the position of having to dig. But if one of us has to dig, I think you're the one with the loaded gun and I'm the one with the shovel.
Oh, I agree.
You agree? Yeah, I thought you might.